Greetings, Dr. Mark Winton here from the University of Central Florida Department of Criminal Justice, and in this video I'd like to address social control and deviance and use several case studies. Just to give you an update, in my own community the big issue is going to be whether to ban gas-powered leaf blowers, and there's going to be a lot of debate about that, and I'm sure social control is going to become an issue in the debate. Always interesting to watch these types of scenarios evolve. Hopefully I can get through this particular presentation without any leaf blowers because it's early in the morning on a Sunday and it's very quiet. So a great time to make a video. So how do we make sense of the ways that we construct our definition of what's considered deviance? And how does that relate to law and, of course, punishment? Think about it. If there's a particular objective way you have of analyzing what's deviant, what's not, what should be or should not be a law, and what should be the punishment or outcomes of breaking that law. And, of course, we'll look at history here. And what I'd like to do is talk a little bit about Professor Erickson's book, Wayward Puritans, A Study in the Sociology of Deviance. This, to me, is an amazing book. It was first published in 1966 and republished in 2005 with a new foreword and afterword by the author. I have trouble getting the book for courses now, and that's unfortunate. That I actually use this textbook in previous law and social control courses that I taught several years ago. So the case studies here revolve around several 17th century situations that are defined as deviant, illegal, and dangerous. Today's standards would be very different in terms of these definitions. So we have historical data with sociological interpretation of deviance, and Professor Erickson wants to understand deviance in general, and also the levels of deviance and the shifting boundaries of deviance and law. In essence, this is a book about social control of deviance. And the book, the 2005 edition by K.T. Erickson, Wayward Puritans, A Study in the Sociology of Deviance, is published by Pearson Publishers. On page 14, Erickson states, many of the institutions designed to discourage deviant behavior actually operate in such a way as to perpetuate it. I think it's a pretty profound statement. I'll read that again. Quote from page 14 in his book, many of the institutions designed to discourage deviant behavior actually operate in such a way as to perpetuate it. And there's lots of examples. Currently, we could look at the opium epidemic, opioid epidemic, and some of the factors related to that in the attempt to control it. So, looking back at the themes of Wayward Puritans, that we see that there's a relationship between community boundaries and also the types of deviant behavior that are present. And he asks a couple questions. Is the amount of deviance constant over time? And do we try to keep deviance within bound rather than eradicate it? And how does society basically deal with deviance depending on, and of course when I'm talking about social definitions of what's considered deviant by a large segment of the population. So he looks at the Puritans of Massachusetts Bay in Chapter 2 and looks at how there was that conflict between common law and the Bible and the Puritan code of ethics. Chapter 3, he looks at the shapes of the devil, the antinomian controversy, the Quaker invasion, and the witches of Salem Village. So he looks at boundary changes and agencies of social control. And he compares and contrasts these three cases. So looking at the Quaker invasion in the 1600s, what he asks basically, what happens when a group is different, and what happens when the group challenges the status quo, and what community social control mechanisms are implemented, how are laws used, and did the Puritans advocate torture, and who are the victims and who are the perpetrators in this case. In the case of the witches of Salem Village, here we ask, what were the symptoms of becoming a witch? How would you describe a witch profile? How did the trials proceed? And how can this case study be used to understand modern day witch hunts? Again, who are the victims? Who are the perpetrators? And can we tell? He found also that it's important to look at everyday behavior. And when he was looking at crimes, they were grouped as followed during this time period: crimes against the church, contempt of authority, fornication, disturbing the peace, crimes against property, crimes against person, and other. So, the definitions of crime and control obviously change throughout our, historical time periods. And he looks at the relationships between witchcraft and other factors that come into play here: religion, gender, how good and evil is conceptualized, scapegoating and blaming, popular culture, public performance of punishment, links to sexuality, social transformations, and other fears. Those are actually other factors that we can observe based on Erikson's ideas. In chapter 5, Erikson talks about a dichotomous society, and here we can get into all kinds of discussions about free will versus determinism, and deviance as illness to be treated perhaps, and also repentance. So in essence, and he starts pointing out here in his book, Emile Durkheim's idea that deviant behavior is functional for society, that we need deviance so we can define the boundaries, what's deviant, what's not deviant. Several hundred years later, we move toward models of punishment versus models of rehabilitation, and we've seen that today. And then moving into the afterward, there's other cases that Erikson references, like the Chinese Cultural Revolution, the Soviet Purge, the Reign of Terror in France, lynchings in the United States, political witch hunts, and moving convicts from England to Australia. So there's all kinds of cases that we could bring in here and continue the conversation. So some questions, I might have here to kind of sum up this is: how does deviance bring people together? And how does the community decide which behaviors need special attention? What about the levels of deviance and the shifting boundaries? So there's 3 basic themes here. Each community has its own boundaries, identity, and styles of deviant behavior. I went to undergrad and grad school and worked in Florida for quite some time. And then when I went to get my doctorate, I went up to University of Connecticut. Yeah, UConn. I went up to University of Connecticut, and I was teaching Introduction to Sociology my first semester up there. And I would tell them stories about what was going on in Florida, and some of my students were like, no. And I was also telling them about spring break situations and other situations, and they were looking at me and thinking, no, that's not the case. Fortunately, I had a student who had lived in Florida and had moved to Connecticut. He verified everything. He's like, oh, he's right. Oh, yeah. Things, for example, I was talking about corporal punishment in the school system, and students were saying, what? You have corporal punishment in the schools down there? What? I was talking about some other features as well that, and it was quite interesting that different definitions of deviance, different ideas, and each community has its own volume of deviant behavior, and agencies will try to keep that within certain boundaries. And finally, each community shows how group handles deviant members. So there can be a variety of ways, and you can really do some interesting cross-cultural comparisons as well. Some of the other cases that I've used for comparative purposes is the Great Terror, and looking at the Soviet Purge, basically There's an article by Armstrong, Stalin's Witch Hunt, Magical Thinking and the Great Terror from Totalitarian Movements and Political Religions, Volume 10, 2009, page 221 to 240, where the author, Dr. Armstrong, talks about collective madness, magical thinking, public support, public confessions, political dimensions, show trials, beliefs in witches, and things of that sort. And when we start to explain all these events, we may ask the why, who, what, when, and how, and then apply different models of comparative analysis. I just gave an example on the PowerPoint of Semlin's 2007 from his book Purify and Destroy: The Political Uses of Massacre and Genocide from New York, published from Columbia University Press in New York. And he has some tips on conducting comparative analysis, and Dr. Semlin, I think, has some really good ideas there, such as who applies the social control, who are the targeted victims, how are the enemy and threat constructed, what is the MO, what is the time frame, what are the political and media events, or effects rather, the political and media effects, and what are the aftermath narratives. When we start talking about it, years later, how do we construct it? Also, on the PowerPoint, I have some brief outlines of cults, and from Singer's work, Cults in Our Midst, 2003, Chelsea Bass Publishers, and some of the thought reform aspects related to that, and counselors working with those that are exiting cults and families. Fascinating area. Zellner in 1995, and Professor Zellner's book Countercultures, published by St. Martin's Press. Professor Zellner talks about cults as countercultures, and gives some examples there as well. And so I always ask, kind of what are we currently primed to look at for a new witch hunt in that sense. The last set of slides was a presentation I did in Law and Social Control a while back when I was teaching it in the classroom on exorcism. And I'll just mention a few things here. The book that I got this information from is Wilkinson's 2007, The Vatican's Exorcist, Driving Out the Devil in the 21st Century, published by Warner Books. Fascinating area. I read that book with great interest because I didn't really know anything about exorcism other than what I've seen in the movies. I can't even remember the name, but I mean, there's lots of movies. When I was growing up as a kid in the 60s and 70s, they had all kinds of movies that you'd watch this and you'd have nightmares for weeks and had trouble sleeping. And The Exorcist would probably come to mind if any of you have seen that movie before or read the book, and so that situation. But it's fascinating because exorcism, according to Wilkinson, is ritual using prayer to remove the devil or demons from a person or place. And there's actually International Association of Exorcists, and usually prayer alone is used, but other procedures may be as well. Like I said, I have limited knowledge in this area, but I read the book because I thought it was interesting to think about as an aspect of social control. And Wilkinson talked about the symptoms of this, and I think one of the reasons I bring this up and it grabbed my interest is because it was related to Wayward Puritans, especially the chapters on the witches in Salem and Massachusetts. And so I saw that line there and thought that was interesting, and of course it would be interesting to interview and talk to priests or clergy that perform exorcism. And I also brought in some other cases from other countries as well for comparative purposes, and how other religions deal with similar issues. And of course there's tension, according to Wilkinson, in the church regarding exorcism, and a lot of interesting features there if you're interested in that. book, I highly recommend it. Anyway, that really wraps up my presentation on social control and deviance. And maybe by the end of the semester, I'll know how the gas leaf blower debate has materialized. Look in your community. Every community is going to have deviance, definitions of deviance, and they're going to have methods of social control of that deviance, conflicts over how deviant and deviant groups are defined, and so we're going to see that materialize. And it's interesting. I think earlier on, remember I gave that example of topless dancing in the Central Florida region because it was such a debatable, conflictual issue in the 80s and 90s, basically, and even into the early 2000 years, that it was fascinating to study. I don't hear too much about it now in the media, so I'm thinking other things are on the radar now rather than topless dancing. But again, you can compare that as a case study, and you can compare it to other situations that occur, and so bringing in the historical perspective as well is very relevant. All right, I could go on and on and on and on, but I'll wrap it up right now and wish you all well. Thank you.